They laughed when I walked into the boardroom that Tuesday morning. My own family, sitting around that polished mahogany table like they owned the place. My nephew Marcus actually snorted when he saw me, nudging my brother Daniel with his elbow. "Look who decided to show up to the big boy meeting," he whispered, not quite as quietly as he thought. My sister Patricia rolled her eyes and checked her phone, as if my presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. They had no idea that I'd just signed the papers 20 minutes earlier. They had no idea that the woman they'd been calling Aunt Dreamer for the past 15 years now owned 51% of Richardson Industries, the very company that paid their salaries, funded their luxury cars, and covered their children's private school tuitions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Richardson, and at 62 years old, I've learned that sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who've known you the longest. For decades, I was the family's quiet bookkeeper, the woman who balanced their personal accounts, filed their taxes, and listened to their business complaints over Sunday dinners. I was the one they called when their credit cards were declined, when they needed someone to co-sign a loan, or when their latest get-rich-quick scheme needed a small investor. I was reliable Eleanor, practical Eleanor. Eleanor who never took risks and wouldn't know a good business opportunity if it walked up and introduced itself. What they didn't know was that while they were busy building their careers on the foundation my late husband Harold had laid for them, I was quietly building something of my own. Harold Richardson had started Richardson Industries 40 years, ego in our garage, manufacturing custom hardware for construction companies. It began as a small operation, just Harold and 2 part-time employees, but his vision was bigger than anyone realized. He believed in quality over quantity, relationships over transactions, and patience over immediate profit. Those principles, which our family now dismissed as old-fashioned, had built an empire worth $23 million. When Harold passed away 8 years ago, he left the business to be managed by a board of directors, with his younger brother, Daniel as CEO, and our children and their spouses in various executive positions. The family assumed I'd be content with my widow's pension and my small house on Maple Street, that I'd fade into the background like a piece of antique furniture that everyone notices but no one really sees. They assumed I'd continue managing their personal finances because that's what I'd always done, and they assumed I'd never question their business decisions because I'd never shown any interest in the company beyond keeping Harold's books organized. They were wrong on all counts. The first time I suggested expanding into renewable energy hardware during a family dinner, my son David literally patted my hand and said, "Mom, stick to what you know." When I mentioned that our biggest competitor had just lost a major contract due to quality issues and we could capitalize on that opportunity, my daughter-in-law Jessica laughed and said, "Eleanor, you're so sweet, but running a company isn't like balancing a checkbook." When I pointed out that our inventory management system was costing us thousands in waste each quarter, Marcus actually said, "Aunt Eleanor, maybe you should take up gardening instead of trying to garden our business." Each dismissal stung, but I learned to keep my observations to myself. I learned to nod politely when they made decisions I knew were mistakes, to smile quietly when they celebrated victories I'd predicted months earlier, and to offer comfort when their short-sighted strategies inevitably backfired. I became invisible in plain sight, the woman who brought casseroles to family gatherings and wrote birthday checks, whose opinions on anything beyond household matters were treated as charming but irrelevant chatter. But invisibility, I discovered, can be a powerful tool when you know how to use it. While they were busy dismissing me, I was busy learning. I enrolled in online business courses under my maiden name, Martha Fleming. I studied market trends, financial analysis, and strategic planning through university extension programs that I attended in the next county over. I read every industry publication, analyzed our competitors' annual reports, and tracked market fluctuations with the same meticulous attention I'd once given to Harold's ledgers. I even hired a private business consultant, a sharp young woman named Amanda Chen, who helped me understand the gaps in Richardson Industries' current strategy. The more I learned, the more I realized how much potential my family was wasting. Richardson Industries was profitable, yes, but it was coasting on Harold's reputation and legacy contracts rather than innovating or expanding. They were so focused on maintaining the status quo that they were missing opportunities worth millions. The renewable energy sector was exploding, and our manufacturing capabilities could easily be adapted to produce solar panel mounting systems and wind turbine hardware. 3 major construction companies had approached us about exclusive partnerships, but Daniel had turned them down because he didn't want to risk changing our product line. Marcus had rejected a lucrative government contract because the paperwork seemed too complicated. I watched them make these decisions from my corner of the family room during board meetings that Harold had always insisted I attend, though no one ever asked for my input. I watched them choose comfortable mediocrity over calculated growth, watched them prioritize their golf schedules over strategic planning sessions, watched them treat the company like a personal ATM rather than a business that required vision and leadership. The breaking point came during last Christmas dinner. I had spent weeks researching a potential acquisition opportunity. Hartwell Manufacturing, a smaller company that specialized in eco-friendly building materials, was struggling financially due to poor management but had excellent products and loyal customers. Their technology combined with our distribution network could have opened entirely new markets for us. The asking price was reasonable, the due diligence was promising, and the potential return on investment was substantial. I had prepared a comprehensive analysis, complete with financial projections, market research, and implementation timelines. I waited until after dessert when everyone was relaxed and in good spirits to bring up my proposal. I had practiced my presentation, anticipated their questions, and prepared answers for every objection I could imagine. I was nervous but confident, excited to finally contribute something meaningful to the family business beyond my usual bookkeeping services. "I've been looking at an interesting opportunity," I began, placing my folder on the table. "There's a company called Hartwell Manufacturing that could be a perfect fit for Richardson Industries. They specialize in sustainable building materials, and their technology could help us expand into the green construction market." The conversation stopped. Daniel looked up from his brandy with the expression of someone who'd just heard his grandmother announce she was joining a motorcycle gang. Patricia actually snorted. "Mom," David said with exaggerated patience, "we've talked about this. You don't understand how complicated business acquisitions are." "I've done my research," I continued, opening the folder to reveal my analysis. "Their revenue streams complement ours perfectly, and the market demand for eco-friendly construction materials is projected to grow by 40% over the next 5 years. Marcus leaned back in his chair and shook his head with amusement. "Aunt Eleanor, you've been watching too much CNBC. Acquisitions aren't something you research on the internet. They require real business experience." "I have the financial projections. Right here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The initial investment would be recovered within 18 months, and the long-term profit potential is significant." Jessica exchanged a look with Patricia that I wasn't supposed to see, but couldn't miss. "Eleanor," she said with the tone people use when explaining things to children, "sustainable materials are just a trend. Real construction companies want reliable traditional products, not experimental green stuff. The government is offering tax incentives for green building projects," I persisted. "3 of our biggest clients have specifically asked about eco-friendly options. This could position us as industry leaders instead of followers." Daniel set down his glass and leaned forward with the authority that came with his CEO title. "Mom, I know you mean well, but you don't understand the complexities involved in running a manufacturing company. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Harold left the business to us because he knew we had the experience and judgment to make these kinds of decisions. Your job is to keep our personal books balanced, and you do that beautifully. Leave the corporate strategy to those of us who understand it. The words hit me like physical blows. Not because they were cruel, but because they were delivered with such casual certainty, such absolute dismissal of everything I'd learned and everything I could contribute. Marcus nodded, along as if Daniel had said something profound. Patricia was already looking at her phone again. David reached over and patted my hand, the same gesture he'd used when I was upset about Harold's death, the gesture that said, there, without saying anything at all. I think it's wonderful that you're taking an interest in the business, Jessica added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But maybe you could find a nice volunteer opportunity instead. Something more suited to your skills? I closed the folder slowly, my hands trembling slightly with something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't far from it. I looked around the table at these people I'd raised, supported and loved, and saw strangers. I saw people who'd benefited from Harold's legacy and my quiet support, but had never bothered to consider that I might have something valuable to offer, beyond my services as their personal accountant and emotional caretaker. You're right, I said quietly. I should stick to what I know. They all relaxed visibly, pleased that the uncomfortable moment had passed and normalcy could resume. Marcus launched into a story about his latest vacation to Cabo. Patricia started, planning the next family gathering. David began discussing his son's college applications. The conversation flowed around me as if I'd never spoken, as if my words had been nothing more than a minor interruption in their important adult discussions. But something fundamental had shifted in that moment. Something that had been building for years, through all those dismissed suggestions and patronizing smiles and casual dismissals, finally crystallized into clarity. I did need to stick to what I knew. And what I knew, after months of study and analysis and careful observation, was that my family was running Harold's company into comfortable mediocrity while sitting on a goldmine of unrealized potential. What I also knew was that Richardson Industries was a privately held corporation, and Harold's will had included provisions that none of them had bothered to read carefully. Provisions about what would happen if the company's performance fell below certain metrics, or if shareholders representing a certain percentage of ownership requested changes in management. Provisions that Harold had insisted on including because he'd understood something my family had forgotten. That ownership and leadership were privileges that had to be earned every day, not birthrights that could be taken for granted. I smiled and nodded through the rest of the evening, asked appropriate questions about everyone's lives, and complimented Jessica on her new earrings. I helped clear the table and sent everyone home with leftover pie, just as I always did. But inside, I was already making plans. The next morning, I called Amanda Chen and scheduled a meeting. Not to discuss theoretical strategies or hypothetical investments, but to begin the process of putting my money where my family thought my mouth didn't belong. If they wanted me to stick to what I knew, then I would show them exactly what I'd learned about business, about strategy, and about the company that Harold had built, and they were slowly strangling with their lack of vision. I had been invisible for 8 years, dismissed and underestimated and treated like a relic from a simpler time. But invisible also meant unnoticed, and unnoticed meant they had no idea what I'd been doing with my time, my resources, or my growing understanding of how their world really worked. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began the week after Christmas, when I sat in Amanda Chen's downtown office with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands and a legal pad covered in notes spread across her glass desk. Amanda was 34 years old, Harvard MBA, and had built her consulting firm from nothing into a multi-million-dollar operation that specialized in helping undervalued companies realize their potential. She was also, I'd learned during our previous conversations, someone who understood what it meant to be underestimated. "Tell me about Richardson Industries' current ownership structure," she said, her pen poised above her own notepad. Daniel owns 30% as CEO, I began, reading from my careful notes. David and Patricia each own 15%. Marcus and Jessica each own 10% through their marriages. The remaining 20% is held in a trust that was supposed to provide for Harold's grandchildren's education. Amanda nodded, making calculations on her tablet. And you? I don't own any shares directly, I admitted. Harold left me the house, a pension, and what he called appropriate support for my lifetime. The family assumes that means I'm dependent on their generosity. But you're not. Not even close. I opened my portfolio folder, the one I'd been building for 8 years with the same methodical care I'd once applied to Harold's business records. Harold was more generous than anyone realized. The life insurance policy alone was substantial, and I've been investing the proceeds very carefully. I also inherited my mother's estate 5 years ago, and my sister's trust fund came to me when she passed. Plus, I've been living very modestly and saving most of my pension. Amanda's eyebrows rose as she reviewed my financial statements. Eleanor, you're sitting on almost $4 million in liquid assets. $4,200,000, I corrected, plus the house and some other investments. Have you told your family about this? I shook my head. They've never asked, and I've never volunteered the information. They assume I'm living on Social Security and Harold's modest pension. They have no idea that Harold's insurance policy was much larger than they thought, or that my family had money they never knew about. Amanda leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. So they think you're a financially dependent widow with no business experience. That's exactly what they think. And they have no idea that you've been studying business strategy, market analysis, and corporate finance for the past 2 years. None whatsoever. This is perfect. Amanda's smile widened. Eleanor, I think it's time we had a conversation about leveraged buyouts. Over the next 3 hours, Amanda explained how we could structure an acquisition that would give me controlling interest in Richardson Industries. The company was privately held, which meant shares weren't publicly traded, but that also meant that any shareholder could sell their stake to any buyer they chose. The key was finding shareholders who were willing to sell, and doing it quietly enough that the current management wouldn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Your nephew Marcus is the weak link, Amanda said, pulling up his financial records on her computer. He's heavily leveraged, owes significant money on his house and his boat, and his gambling debts are substantial. He'd probably sell his 10% for the right price. How do you know about his gambling debts? I know people who know people, Amanda said with a shrug. Business intelligence is part of what you're paying me for. Your son David is also vulnerable. His new business venture is failing, and he's been using his Richardson Industries dividends to keep it afloat. If someone offered him cash for his shares, especially if the offer came with a confidentiality agreement, he might be tempted. What about Daniel and Patricia? Daniel's position as CEO is tied to his shareholding. He won't sell unless he's forced to. Patricia is more interesting. She's been talking about retiring early and moving to Florida. If the right opportunity came along, she might be willing to cash out her 15%. I stared at the numbers Amanda had written on her whiteboard. So if I could acquire Marcus's 10%, David's 15%, and Patricia's 15%, that would give me 40%. Plus the 20% educational trust, Amanda added. I did some research on that trust structure. Harold set it up with very specific language about how the funds could be used and who could control them. As his widow and the grandmother of the beneficiaries, you have more influence over that trust than anyone realizes. That would give me 60%. Controlling interest, Amanda confirmed. Enough to restructure the board, replace management, and implement any strategic changes you see fit. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. For 8 years, I'd been the family's quiet supporter. the woman who brought casseroles and wrote checks and listened to their problems. The thought of walking into their boardroom as their new boss felt like imagining myself as a completely different person. What would happen to their jobs? I asked. That would be entirely up to you, Amanda said. You could keep them on with reduced responsibilities, you could offer them severance packages, or you could restructure their roles to better match their actual capabilities. The point is, it would be your decision. I thought about Marcus's smirk when I'd tried to share my acquisition proposal. I thought about Jessica's condescending smile and David's patronizing pat on my hand. I thought about Daniel's casual dismissal of everything I'd learned and everything I could contribute. How long would this take? If we move carefully and quietly, about 6 months. We'd need to approach each potential seller individually, structure the deals to avoid raising suspicions, and coordinate the timing so that by the time anyone realizes what's happening, the transfers are already complete. And you think this could actually work? Amanda looked at me with the serious expression of someone who'd built her career on turning long shots into victories. Eleanor, I've seen hostile takeovers of Fortune 500 companies that were less strategic than what we're planning. You have the financial resources, the inside knowledge, and most importantly, you have the element of surprise. They've spent so many years underestimating you that they can't imagine you as a threat. I left that meeting with a detailed action plan, a timeline, and a new understanding of what was possible when someone stopped accepting other people's limitations and started believing in their own capabilities. The woman who walked out of Amanda's office that January afternoon wasn't the same woman who'd been dismissed at Christmas dinner. She was someone who'd decided to stop being invisible and start being powerful. The first approach came in February, and it was easier than I'd anticipated. Marcus had been complaining about money troubles for months, though he'd been careful to frame it as temporary cash flow issues rather than serious financial problems. Amanda had done her research thoroughly. His gambling debts were worse than anyone in the family knew, and his wife was threatening to leave him if he didn't get control of his spending. I invited him to lunch at the country club, the same place where I'd been taking family members for birthday celebrations and anniversary dinners for decades. To Marcus, it was just another meal with his generous aunt, the woman who'd helped him with his down payment and co-signed his business loan years earlier. You seem stressed lately, I said over our salads, using the gentle concern that had always been my role in family dynamics. It's nothing I can't handle, he replied. But his smile was strained. Just some temporary setbacks. You know how business can be. Actually, I've been thinking about business a lot lately, I said carefully. Harold always said that sometimes the best investment strategy is to diversify, to not have all your assets tied up in one place. Marcus nodded absently, more focused on his phone than on our conversation. I've been wondering if you'd ever considered selling your Richardson Industries shares, I continued. Not because there's anything wrong with the company, but because it might give you more flexibility with your other investments. That got his attention. Sell my shares? Why would I do that? Well, they're not exactly liquid assets, I pointed out. And if you ever needed cash for other opportunities, you'd have to ask the family for approval. But if you sold them to an outside investor, you'd have immediate access to that capital. Who would want to buy shares in a family business? I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice as if sharing a confidence. I've been talking to some investment advisors about diversifying my own portfolio. There are private equity firms that specialize in acquiring small stakes in profitable manufacturing companies. They're not interested in management or operations, just steady returns. Marcus's eyes sharpened with interest. How much would they pay? Well, that would depend on the valuation, but I was told that Richardson Industries shares might be worth significantly more than their book value. The right buyer might pay a premium for a stake in such a stable, profitable company. Over the next hour, I carefully planted the seeds of an idea without ever making a direct offer. I mentioned that I knew some people who might be interested in discussing a purchase. I suggested that he might want to get his shares independently, appraised to understand their true market value. I even offered to put him in touch with my financial advisor, who could explain how such a transaction might work. By the time we finished lunch, Marcus was practically vibrating with excitement about the possibility of converting his Richardson Industries shares into immediate cash. He had no idea that my financial advisor was Amanda Chen, or that the private equity firm interested in his shares was a company I'd established specifically for this purpose. 2 weeks later, Marcus signed an agreement to sell his 10% stake in Richardson Industries to Fleming Capital Management for $200,000 more than he'd ever imagined those shares were worth. The transaction included a strict confidentiality clause that prevented him from discussing the sale with anyone in the family for 6 months. He was so thrilled with the windfall that he never questioned why a stranger would pay such a premium for shares in a company they'd never seen. David was the next target, and his approach required a different strategy. Unlike Marcus, David wasn't motivated by immediate financial pressure. His struggling software company was bleeding money, but he still had enough pride to reject anything. That seemed like charity. The key with David was appealing to his entrepreneurial ego. I scheduled a coffee meeting with him in March, ostensibly to discuss his business and offer motherly support during his difficult period. David had always been my dreamer, the child who started projects with enormous enthusiasm and then lost interest when the work became tedious. His current venture, a social media platform for small businesses, had all the hallmarks of his previous failed attempts at entrepreneurship. "I'm so proud of how hard you're working on your platform," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. "It reminds me of your father when he was starting Richardson Industries." David's face lit up with the validation he'd been craving. "Thanks, Mom. It's been challenging, but I really think we're on the verge of a breakthrough." "I'm sure you are," I agreed, "although I imagine it's frustrating to have so much of your capital tied up in Richardson Industries shares when you could be investing it in your own company." "Well, those shares are family legacy," David said carefully. "Dad always said they were our safety net." "Of course, and that was wonderful advice when you were younger. But now that you're building your own legacy, it might make sense to have more flexibility with your investments." I let the idea percolate for a few minutes while we discussed his business challenges and his vision for the platform's future. Then, as if the thought had just occurred to me, I mentioned that I'd been learning about something called angel investing. There are wealthy individuals who specialize in providing capital to promising entrepreneurs, I explained. They're not like traditional banks or venture capitalists. They understand that sometimes the best investments are in people rather than just business plans. David was intrigued, but skeptical. "Those kinds of investors want equity stakes and board seats. I'm not ready to give up control of my company." "Not all of them," I said. "Some prefer to make loans with favorable terms, especially to entrepreneurs who have other assets that could serve as collateral." Over the next several weeks, I carefully introduced David to the concept of using his Richardson Industries shares as collateral for a business loan. Through Amanda's connections, we arranged for him to meet with a private lender who was impressed with his platform and willing to offer him a substantial loan at below-market rates. The only requirement was that he transfer his Richardson Industries shares to an escrow account as security for the loan. The beauty of this arrangement was that David still felt like he owned his family shares, even though they were technically controlled by the escrow company, which was another entity I'd established through Amanda's legal team. If David's business succeeded and he repaid the loan, he'd get his shares back. If his business failed, which seemed increasingly likely given his track record, the shares would become the property of the lender. David signed the agreement in April, convinced that he'd found the perfect solution to his capital needs without sacrificing his family legacy. He had no idea that the generous lender was his own mother, or that the loan terms had been structured to make default almost inevitable. Patricia was the most challenging target because she was also the smartest. Unlike Marcus and David, she'd always been skeptical of deals that seemed too good to be true, and she had enough business experience to ask informed questions. Her approach required months of careful groundwork and a strategy that appealed to her practical nature rather than her emotions or ego. The opportunity came when Patricia mentioned during a family dinner that she was considering early retirement. Her husband Robert had inherited a substantial amount of money from his father's estate, and they'd been talking about buying a house in St. Augustine and spending their golden years near the beach. "The only thing holding us back is liquidity," she confided during a private conversation after dinner. "Most of our assets are tied up in retirement accounts and the Richardson Industries shares. We'd need to convert some of that equity into cash to make the move. Have you considered selling the shares?" I asked, as innocently as possible. "To whom? It's not like there's a market for minority stakes in family businesses." "Well, there might be more options than you think," I said carefully. "I've been learning about private equity and family office investments. Some firms specialize in acquiring stakes in profitable private companies, especially ones with steady cash flow and growth potential." Patricia was immediately suspicious. "Why are you suddenly so interested in private equity?" "Harold always said I should understand business better," I replied. "I've been taking some courses, reading about investments. It's fascinating how many opportunities exist that most people never hear about." Over the next month, I fed Patricia carefully researched information about the market for minority stakes in manufacturing companies. Through Amanda's network, I arranged for her to receive unsolicited inquiries from legitimate investment firms who were interested in learning more about Richardson Industries. None of these firms were serious buyers, but their interest validated the concept that her shares had value beyond their role as family legacy assets. The breakthrough came when Patricia and Robert found their dream house in Florida. The sellers were motivated to close quickly, but Patricia and Robert needed to act fast to secure the property. Suddenly, the theoretical conversation about selling her Richardson Industries shares became an urgent financial need. Amanda had anticipated this scenario and prepared accordingly. Within 48 hours of Patricia's call, I was able to present her with an offer from Heritage Family Investments, a firm that specialized in acquiring minority stakes in family businesses. The offer was for significantly more than Patricia had expected, came with a quick closing timeline, and included terms that allowed her to maintain her emotional connection to the company even after the sale. Patricia spent 2 weeks conducting due diligence on Heritage Family Investments, which Amanda had created with enough documentation and history to withstand professional scrutiny. The firm appeared to be exactly what it claimed: a family office, investment vehicle that acquired small stakes in profitable companies and held them for long-term appreciation. Patricia signed the sale agreement in June, convinced that she'd found the perfect buyer for her shares. Someone who understood family, businesses, respected their traditions, and would be a silent partner rather than an active participant in company operations. She had no idea that Heritage Family Investments was controlled by Fleming Capital Management, which was controlled by the same woman who'd been bringing casseroles to family dinners for 8 years. By July, I owned 40% of Richardson Industries through my various investment entities. The educational trust required a different approach, but Amanda had identified the legal mechanisms that would give me control over those shares as well. As the widow of the trust's creator and the grandmother of its beneficiaries, I had significant influence over how the trust's assets were managed, especially if I could demonstrate that the current management was not acting in the best interests of the trust's long-term value. The final piece of the puzzle was timing. I needed to consolidate my control over the educational trust and announce my new position before anyone in the family realized what had happened. The moment of revelation needed to be dramatic enough to prevent them from organizing any effective resistance, but professional enough to establish my credibility as their new majority shareholder. Amanda suggested that we call a special board meeting for late July, ostensibly to discuss the company's mid-year performance and strategic planning for the following year. The meeting would be held in Richardson Industries conference room, with all family members in attendance, just as Harold had always insisted. But this time, instead of sitting quietly in the corner while they made decisions, I would be walking in as their new boss. The irony was perfect. The same people who'd spent years dismissing my business opinions would now be legally obligated to listen to everything I had to say. The morning of the board meeting arrived with the kind of crisp August clarity that makes everything seem sharper, more defined. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the navy blue suit I'd purchased, specifically for this occasion. Not the soft cardigans and floral dresses my family was accustomed to seeing me wear, but a tailored business suit that commanded respect. The woman looking back at me was someone I was still getting used to. Someone who belonged in boardrooms and made decisions that affected millions of dollars. Amanda had spent the previous week coaching me on presentation techniques, helping me rehearse not just what I would say, but how I would say it. My voice needed to carry authority without seeming aggressive, confidence without appearing arrogant. I had practiced in front of the mirror until every gesture felt natural, every inflection purposeful. The drive to Richardson Industries took exactly 12 minutes, the same route I'd traveled countless times over the years when Harold was alive and I'd bring him lunch or pick up documents. But today felt different. Today, I wasn't the supportive wife arriving to help with paperwork. I was the majority shareholder coming to claim what was mine. The building looked smaller than I remembered, though nothing about it had actually changed. The same brick facade Harold had been so proud of, the same glass doors with Richardson Industries etched in gold lettering, the same parking lot where I'd waited in the car during so many meetings I wasn't invited to attend. But my perspective had shifted so dramatically that even familiar landmarks seemed transformed. I parked in the visitor's space closest to the main entrance, not because I had to, but because I wanted to walk through those front doors like any other executive arriving for work. The receptionist, a young woman named Bethany who'd always been polite but distant, looked up with surprise when she saw me. "Mrs. Richardson, are you here for the board meeting?" "I am," I replied, noting how her assumption that I was merely attending rather than leading revealed everything about how my family had positioned me over the years. "They're already gathering in the conference room. Can I get you some coffee?" "That would be lovely, thank you." I signed the visitor's log, a formality that would soon become obsolete, and made my way down the hallway lined with framed photographs chronicling the company's history. Harold at various ribbon cuttings and award ceremonies, the original garage, where everything began. Pictures of our first major contracts and milestone celebrations. My face appeared in exactly 3 of those photographs, always in the background, always smiling supportively while Harold accepted recognition for achievements we'd built together. The conference room door was open, and I could hear familiar voices inside discussing quarterly reports and production schedules. Daniel was explaining something about supply chain optimization, while Marcus nodded along without really listening. Patricia was taking notes on her tablet with the efficiency that had made her a competent operations manager, though never an innovative one. David sat slightly apart from the others, clearly uncomfortable with the formal business atmosphere, but trying to project executive confidence. I paused outside the door, taking one final moment to appreciate the magnitude of what was about to happen. These people had spent 8 years treating me like a benevolent but irrelevant family member, someone whose opinions on business matters were charming but ultimately worthless. In the next few minutes, their entire understanding of family, dynamics, and corporate hierarchy would be permanently altered. "Good morning, everyone," I said, stepping into the room with the briefcase Amanda had helped me select, the one that looked serious and professional without being ostentatious. They all looked up with varying degrees of surprise and mild annoyance. Clearly, no one had expected me to arrive on time, and probably several of them had hoped I might skip the meeting entirely. "Eleanor," Daniel said with forced enthusiasm, "glad you could make it. We're just reviewing the quarterly numbers before we get started." Excellent, I replied, taking a seat at the far end of the table, the same chair I'd occupied during dozens of previous meetings. I'm very interested in hearing about our performance. Jessica, who had married into the family but had always treated company meetings like social obligations, glanced at her watch. Should we wait for the lawyer? Didn't you say someone from Morrison and Associates was joining us today? They'll be here shortly, Daniel confirmed. We're going to be discussing some structural changes to the board composition, updating some outdated language in our corporate bylaws. Nothing too exciting, just housekeeping, really. I smiled politely. The same expression I'd perfected over years of listening to family members explain things they assumed I couldn't understand. What Daniel didn't know was that Morrison and Associates was no longer representing the company's interests. Amanda had arranged for me to retain their services 3 weeks earlier, and they were now working exclusively for me. The structural changes Daniel anticipated would be far more dramatic than he imagined. Marcus was scrolling through his phone with the casual disregard for meeting protocol that had always irritated Harold. How long is this going to take? I've got a client call at 11. It shouldn't take too long, I said quietly, though you might want to clear your schedule for the rest of the day. Something in my tone must have registered because Marcus looked up from his phone with a slightly puzzled expression. Before he could respond, there was a knock on the conference room door. Come in, Daniel called. James Morrison, the firm's senior partner, entered the room followed by Amanda Chen and 2 associates I didn't recognize. The introduction of outside advisors immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Suddenly, everyone was sitting straighter, speaking more formally, projecting the kind of professional competence they thought the situation required. Thank you all for gathering today, James began, setting his briefcase on the table with the gravity that significant legal announcements demand. We're here to discuss some important changes in Richardson Industries' ownership structure. Daniel leaned forward with the confidence of someone who believed he was in control of the situation. As I mentioned to everyone earlier, we're just updating some language in our corporate documents. Nothing that should affect day-to-day operations. Actually, James replied, opening his briefcase and removing a stack of documents. The changes we're here to discuss are quite substantial. Over the past 6 months, there have been several significant transfers of Richardson Industries shares, and the current ownership structure is very different from what you might expect. I watched the faces around the table as confusion began to replace casual attention. Patricia was the first to realize that something unusual was happening. Her years of operational experience had taught her to recognize when situations weren't developing according to plan. What kind of transfers? She asked. James looked at me, and I nodded slightly. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The moment when years of invisibility would be replaced by undeniable authority. Over the past 6 months, James continued, various shareholders have sold their stakes in Richardson Industries to investment entities controlled by Eleanor Richardson. As of yesterday afternoon, Mrs. Richardson controls 61% of the company's outstanding shares. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the comfortable quiet of people processing routine information, but the stunned stillness that comes when reality shifts so dramatically that immediate comprehension becomes impossible. David was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. That's not possible. Amanda opened her tablet and began reading from a prepared statement. On February 15th, Marcus Richardson sold his 10% stake to Fleming Capital Management. On April 3rd, David Richardson pledged his 15% stake as collateral for a business loan, with those shares transferring to lender control upon default, which occurred on July 10th. On June 22nd, Patricia Richardson sold her 15% stake to Heritage Family Investments. And as of yesterday, Eleanor Richardson assumed control of the 20% educational trust established by Harold Richardson. Marcus had gone completely pale. I sold my shares to An investment firm. Some private equity company. Fleming Capital Management, I said quietly, which is a company I established specifically for that purpose. The loan, David stammered. The business loan. You're telling me that was also arranged through entities I control, I confirmed. Your business failed to meet its revenue projections, triggering the default clause we discussed. Your shares are now mine. Patricia was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of respect and something that might have been fear. Heritage Family Investments, the family office that bought my shares. Another company I created, I acknowledged. They were very impressed with your due diligence, by the way. You asked all the right questions. Daniel had been silent throughout. These revelations? But I could see him performing rapid calculations, trying to understand how the family dynamic had shifted so completely without his knowledge. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority he'd been accustomed to wielding, though now it sounded hollow and uncertain. This is impossible. You don't have that kind of money. You're living on Harold's pension and Social Security. I opened my own briefcase and removed a folder containing financial statements that Amanda had prepared for exactly this moment. Actually, Daniel, I have considerably more resources than anyone in this family has ever bothered to ask about. Harold's life insurance policy was much larger than you realized. My mother's estate was substantial. My sister Elizabeth left me everything when she passed, and I've been investing very carefully for 8 years. How much money are we talking? About? Jessica asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Enough to acquire controlling interest in Richardson Industries and implement the strategic changes that Harold always envisioned but that current management has been too conservative to pursue. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see each family member processing the implications. They weren't just dealing with a shift in ownership percentages. They were confronting the reality that the woman they'd dismissed as financially dependent and business naive had outmaneuvered them completely. What does this mean for our positions? Patricia asked, demonstrating the practical thinking that had always made her the most competent member of the current management team. That depends, I replied, on your willingness to embrace change and your ability to contribute value rather than simply maintaining status quo. James Morrison cleared his throat and began distributing documents to each family member. Mrs. Richardson has prepared a comprehensive restructuring plan that addresses both immediate operational changes and long-term strategic goals. You'll each receive copies of the proposal, along with revised employment agreements that reflect the new ownership structure. I stood and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the conference room, the same whiteboard where Harold used to sketch out his vision for the company's future during meetings I'd attended, but never participated in. Now it was my turn to present ideas, and this time everyone would be obligated to listen. Richardson Industries has been profitable under the current management structure, I began, uncapping a marker with the steady confidence Amanda had taught me to project. But profitability and success are not the same thing. We've been coasting on Harold's reputation and legacy relationships, while our competitors have been innovating and expanding. I drew a simple chart showing the company's revenue growth over the past 5 years, numbers I'd memorized during my months of research. Our growth rate has been consistently below industry averages. We've rejected expansion opportunities that our competitors have embraced successfully. We've ignored market trends that could have positioned us as industry leaders. Marcus was shaking his head in disbelief. You're talking about business strategy, like you actually understand it. I understand it better than you might think, I replied, drawing additional charts that illustrated market opportunities in renewable energy hardware and sustainable construction materials. I've spent 2 years studying our industry, analyzing our competitors, and identifying the gaps in our current approach. The same gaps I tried to discuss during Christmas dinner, before I was told to stick to balancing checkbooks. David was staring at the financial projections I'd written on the board. These numbers, are they real? Completely real, Amanda confirmed, handing him a detailed market analysis. We've conducted extensive research on every opportunity Mrs. Richardson is proposing. The renewable energy sector alone represents a potential revenue increase of 40% within 3 years. Why didn't you tell us you were planning this? Patricia asked, and for the first time since the meeting began, she sounded more hurt than angry. I set down the marker and looked at each family member individually before responding. Because every time I tried to contribute ideas or suggest improvements, I was dismissed. When I proposed the Hartwell Manufacturing acquisition, Marcus told me I'd been watching too much CNBC. When I pointed out inefficiencies in our inventory management, Jessica suggested I take up gardening instead. When I offered market analysis, Daniel explained that business was too complicated for me to understand. The truth of those statements was undeniable, and I could see recognition dawning on their faces. They were remembering their own words, their own dismissive attitudes, their own assumptions about my capabilities and contributions. So instead of continuing to offer suggestions that would be ignored, I continued, I decided to put myself in a position where my ideas would have to be taken seriously. The same ideas you rejected when I was just Harold's widow are now company policy because I'm your majority shareholder. Daniel was reviewing the restructuring documents with the focused intensity of someone trying to find flaws in an airtight legal strategy. What happens to us? To our jobs? That depends on your performance and your willingness to adapt, I replied. The company needs leadership that's focused on growth rather than maintenance, innovation rather than tradition, and results rather than relationships. Are you firing us? David asked bluntly. I'm offering you the opportunity to prove that you deserve the positions you've held, I said. Under new management structure, with clear performance metrics and accountability standards. James Morrison began explaining the specific terms of the restructuring plan. Daniel would remain as CEO, but with reduced autonomy and oversight from a new board of directors that I would control. Patricia could continue as operations manager, but would be expected to implement efficiency improvements that she'd previously resisted. Marcus and David would have their roles significantly reduced, with the option to accept severance packages if they preferred not to work under the new structure. What about dividends? Marcus asked, clearly focused on the financial implications of losing his ownership stake. Shareholders receive dividends, I replied. You're no longer shareholders. The finality of that statement seemed to hit him like a physical blow. For years, Marcus had counted on his Richardson Industries dividends to supplement his income and fund his lifestyle. Now that source of passive income was gone, replaced by the need to actually earn his salary through performance. This is vindictive, Jessica said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. You're punishing us for treating you like family instead of like a business partner. I'm not punishing anyone, I replied calmly. I'm implementing the same performance standards that any competent business owner would require. If you find those standards punitive, that says more about your previous expectations than about my management style. Amanda distributed additional documents outlining the specific changes each department would undergo. The renewable energy division I'd been advocating for would be established immediately, with substantial capital investment and aggressive growth targets. The acquisition opportunities that had been rejected would be revisited with proper due diligence. The efficiency improvements I'd identified would be implemented over the next 6 months. How long have you been planning this? Patricia asked, studying the comprehensive nature of the restructuring plan. Seriously? About 8 months, I replied. But in some ways, I've been preparing for this moment since Harold died. Every time I was excluded from a decision, every time my input was dismissed, every time I was treated like a dependent rather than a partner, I was learning what needed to change. Harold never intended for you to run the company, Daniel said, making one final attempt to assert the authority he'd held for 8 years. Harold intended for the company to succeed, I replied. He believed in innovation, calculated risks, and putting the business first. The Harold I married would have been proud of what I've accomplished, even if the family I raised doesn't understand it yet. The meeting continued for another 2 hours as James Morrison and Amanda explained the legal and operational details of the transition. Each family member would have 48 hours to review their new employment agreements and decide whether to accept the restructured roles or pursue other opportunities. The changes would take effect immediately, with the new board of directors meeting scheduled for the following week. As people began gathering their documents and preparing to leave, I remained seated at the head of the table, observing the family dynamics that had shifted so dramatically in a single morning. These were still the people I'd loved and supported for decades, but our relationship would never again be based on my willingness to remain invisible while they made decisions about assets I'd helped create. Marcus was the first to leave, walking out without saying goodbye, his face reflecting the shock of someone whose assumptions about the world had been permanently shattered. David lingered near the door, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Jessica followed Marcus, her expression suggesting that she was already planning how to explain this development to friends who'd grown accustomed to her casual references to the family business. Patricia approached my chair as the room emptied. I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Of course. Are you doing this because you genuinely believe it's best for the company, or because you wanted to prove that we were wrong about you? I considered the question carefully before responding. Both. The company needs leadership that's focused on growth and innovation. But I also needed to prove to myself that I was capable of more than just supporting other people's decisions. Your dismissal of my ideas forced me to find another way to make those ideas reality. Patricia nodded slowly. I remember the Christmas dinner conversation about the Hartwell acquisition. I looked into that company after you brought it up. And you were right. It would have been a smart investment. They were eventually acquired by one of our competitors for exactly the price you'd suggested. I know, I said quietly. I've been tracking all the opportunities we've missed. How many other ideas have you had that we dismissed? Dozens. All documented, all researched, all ignored. Patricia gathered her documents and headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. For what it's worth, I'm sorry we didn't listen, and I'm impressed with what you've accomplished, even if I don't like how it happened. After everyone left, I remained in the conference room with Amanda and James Morrison, reviewing the morning's events and planning the next steps in the transition process. The immediate legal and operational changes were straightforward, but the personal relationships would require more delicate handling. How do you feel? Amanda asked as we organized the documents from the meeting. Relieved, I said, surprised by the truth of that response. For 8 years, I've been carrying ideas and insights that no one wanted to hear. Today was the first time I could speak freely about the company's potential without being dismissed or patronized. And your family? They'll adjust, I said, though I wasn't entirely certain that was true. Or they'll find other opportunities that better suit their expectations and capabilities. James Morrison was packing his briefcase with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd managed many corporate transitions. The legal structure is solid, he said. Your ownership position is unassailable, and the employment agreements provide appropriate protections for both the company and the family members. You've positioned yourself to implement whatever changes you believe are necessary. What about potential challenges? Could they contest the share transfers? Extremely. Unlikely, James replied. Each transaction was conducted with full legal documentation, appropriate due diligence, and voluntary participation from the sellers. Marcus, David, and Patricia all received fair market value for their shares, and the contracts included extensive disclosure language that they signed willingly. So they can't claim they were deceived? They can claim whatever they want, but they'd have no legal basis for challenging transactions they entered into voluntarily after appropriate consideration. Amanda was reviewing her tablet with the satisfied expression of someone whose strategic planning had achieved its intended results. The most important thing now is execution. You have control of the company, but you still need to prove that your vision will actually deliver better results than the previous management approach. The renewable energy division will be profitable within 18 months, I said with the confidence that came from extensive market research and financial modeling. The efficiency improvements will show results even sooner, and the acquisition opportunities I've identified will position us for long-term growth that current management never would have achieved. And if your family decides not to accept the restructured employment agreements, then we'll recruit new management with the experience and vision to implement our growth strategy, I replied. The company's success is more important than family relationships, though I hope we can achieve both. As we prepared to leave the conference room, I took one final look around the space where my transformation from invisible widow to corporate owner had been publicly acknowledged. The same table where I'd been dismissed and patronized for years had become the platform for establishing my authority and presenting my vision for the company's future. Walking out of that building, I felt the weight of responsibility that comes with genuine power. I owned Richardson Industries now, not just financially, but strategically. Every decision would be mine to make. Every success or failure would reflect my judgment and capabilities. The family members who'd spent years underestimating me would now be watching to see whether I could deliver on the promises I'd made and the confidence I'd projected. But I was ready for that challenge. I'd spent 8 years preparing for this opportunity, and I had no intention of wasting it on maintaining the comfortable mediocrity that had characterized the company's recent performance. Harold had built Richardson Industries with vision and ambition. Now it was my turn to honor that legacy by pushing the company beyond what anyone thought possible, including the family members who'd never imagined I was capable of such transformation. The drive home took the same 12 minutes it always had, but I was returning as a completely different person than the one who'd left that morning. The woman who'd been dismissed at Christmas dinner had become the woman who now controlled the room where that dismissal had been delivered, and tomorrow, the real work of proving my capabilities would begin. The first real test of my newfound authority came exactly 72 hours after the boardroom meeting, when I received a call from our largest client threatening to cancel their contract. Thompson Construction had been doing business with Richardson Industries for 15 years, and their account represented nearly 30% of our annual revenue. The timing wasn't coincidental. Mrs. Richardson, Bill Thompson's voice carried the gravitas of a man who'd built a construction empire from nothing and wasn't accustomed to uncertainty in his business relationships. I'm hearing some concerning rumors about changes at your company. My project managers are telling me there might be disruptions to our supply chain. I sat in Harold's old office, which I'd finally claimed as my own, looking out at the manufacturing floor where workers were operating the same equipment they'd been using for years. Nothing about our actual production capabilities had changed, but apparently word of the ownership transition was spreading faster than I'd anticipated. What specific concerns do you have about our ability to serve your needs? I asked, keeping my voice steady and professional. Look, I've got nothing against you personally, Thompson continued, but I knew Harold, and I've been working with Daniel for 8 years. This business is built on relationships and trust. I need to know that the people running things understand construction timelines and quality standards. The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. Thompson was questioning whether a 62-year-old widow who'd never worked in manufacturing could manage the operational complexities of his account. It was the same assumption my family had made, now being echoed by our most important customer. I understand your concerns, I replied. Would it be helpful if we scheduled a meeting to discuss your upcoming projects and how Richardson Industries plans to serve them? I'd like to show you some improvements we're implementing that will actually enhance our service to clients like Thompson Construction. There was a pause on the line, and I could hear Thompson consulting with someone in the background. All right, he said finally, but I want to see concrete evidence that you can deliver what you're promising. And I want to know that if there are problems, you'll have experienced people handling them. Absolutely. How does Thursday at 10 o'clock work for you? Fine. And Mrs. Richardson, I hope you understand how important this relationship is to both our companies. After Thompson hung up, I immediately called Amanda Chen. The conversation had confirmed my suspicions that Daniel, or one of the other family members, was spreading doubt about the company's stability under my leadership. It was a predictable response to losing control, but it was also potentially devastating to our business if not handled properly. We need to accelerate our timeline, I told Amanda. If our clients start questioning our capabilities, we could lose contracts before we have a chance to prove our improvements. What kind of resistance are you encountering? Thompson Construction is nervous about working with new management. Other clients will probably follow suit once they hear about the ownership change. We need to demonstrate competence and stability immediately. Amanda was already typing on her laptop, no doubt updating the implementation schedule we'd developed over the past several months. The renewable energy contracts we've been negotiating could help establish credibility. If we can announce new business while reassuring existing clients, it shows growth rather than disruption. How quickly can we finalize those agreements? Green Tech Solutions has been waiting for us to commit to their solar mounting hardware project. If we can guarantee production capacity and delivery timelines, they'll sign this week. Do it. And I want to schedule meetings with our top 5 clients within the next 10 days. Face-to-face conversations where I can address their concerns directly and present our expansion plans. What about your family? Are they going to support this transition or continue undermining it? That was the critical question. Daniel, Patricia, Marcus, and David had 48 hours to decide whether to accept their restructured roles or leave the company entirely. Based on the client concerns I was already hearing, at least one of them was actively sabotaging my leadership before I'd even had a chance to implement any changes. I'll find out tonight, I said. I've scheduled individual meetings with each of them to discuss their decisions. The first meeting was with Patricia, who had requested to speak with me privately at her house rather than at the office. I arrived at her suburban colonial home at 6 o'clock, carrying a folder with detailed job descriptions and performance metrics for her revised position as Director of Operations. Patricia had always been the most professionally competent member of the family management team, and I genuinely hoped she would choose to stay and contribute to the company's growth. "Come in," she said, gesturing toward her living room with the formal politeness people use when they're not sure how to behave around someone they thought they knew. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Coffee would be nice, thank you." Patricia's house reflected her personality, perfectly organized, efficiently arranged, but lacking any sense of creative flair or personal warmth. The furniture was high quality, but generic. The artwork was tasteful but unremarkable, everything designed to project competence without revealing anything about the person who lived there. "I've been thinking about our conversation on Tuesday," she said, returning with 2 mugs of coffee and settling into the chair across from me. "About the restructuring plan and the new reporting structure. I hope you've had time to review the position description I prepared for you." "I have. And I have to say, the responsibilities you're outlining are significantly more demanding than what I've been doing. Because the company's growth will require significantly more sophisticated operational management," I replied. "We can't expand into new markets with the same systems and processes we've been using for routine manufacturing contracts." Patricia opened her copy of the job description and pointed to several specific requirements: supply chain optimization, vendor relationship management, quality assurance protocols, inventory forecasting. These aren't just operational tasks, they're strategic functions that will determine whether the company succeeds or fails. Exactly. which is why I need someone with your experience and analytical skills to manage them properly. And if I can't meet these performance standards, then we'll provide additional training and support to help you develop the necessary capabilities. But if you're not willing to grow into the role, then I'll need to find someone who is. Patricia set down her coffee and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between respect and apprehension. You're serious about this, aren't you? About actually transforming the company? Completely serious. Harold built Richardson Industries to be a leader in our industry, not a comfortable family legacy that provides steady income without requiring innovation or effort. And you really believe you can manage all of this? The strategic planning, the financial oversight, the personnel decisions? The question wasn't asked with malice, but it carried the same underlying assumption that had motivated my family's dismissiveness for years. Even Patricia, who'd seen the comprehensive research and planning I'd done, still seemed surprised that I might actually be capable of executive leadership. I've been studying business management intensively for 2 years, I replied. I've worked with consultants who specialize in manufacturing companies like ours. I've analyzed our competitors, our market opportunities, and our operational inefficiencies in detail. I understand the challenges we're facing, and I have specific plans for addressing them. What about experience, business school theories? And consultant reports aren't the same as actually managing people and making decisions under pressure. You're right, I acknowledged. I don't have traditional executive experience, but I have something that might be more valuable: objectivity. I'm not invested in maintaining systems that aren't working just because they're familiar. I'm not afraid to make changes that other people might resist because I haven't spent my career climbing the corporate ladder. Patricia was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the documents I'd provided and considering the implications of accepting or rejecting the position I was offering. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a decisiveness that reminded me why Harold had always respected her judgment. I'll accept the restructured position, she said. But I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this out of family loyalty or because I feel obligated to support your decisions. I'm doing it because I think you might actually be right about the company's potential, and I want to be part of realizing that potential. That's exactly the attitude I was hoping for, I replied, genuinely pleased by her response. I need team members who are committed to excellence, not people who are just going through the motions because it's expected. What about Daniel? Have you talked to him yet? Tomorrow night. Why? Patricia hesitated, then decided to share information that she clearly felt I needed to know. He's been calling our major clients, telling them that the company is going through an unstable transition period and that they should consider alternative suppliers until things settle down. The confirmation of my suspicions felt like a punch to the stomach, even though I'd suspected Daniel was behind the client concerns. How do you know this? Because Thompson Construction called me directly to ask about continuity of operations. Bill Thompson specifically mentioned that Daniel had suggested they might want to diversify their supplier relationships. Daniel is actively sabotaging the company, rather than accepting that his management approach wasn't effective. It gets worse, Patricia continued. Marcus has been talking to some of our key employees about finding other jobs. He's telling them that you're planning massive layoffs and that anyone with experience should start looking for positions at our competitors. The scope of the internal resistance was more extensive than I'd anticipated. While I'd been focused on implementing strategic improvements and expanding our market presence, family members who felt displaced were working to undermine my leadership by creating instability and uncertainty among both clients and employees. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because sabotaging the company hurts all of us, including the employees who depend on Richardson Industries for their livelihoods. Whatever personal issues Daniel and Marcus have with your leadership, destroying the business isn't an acceptable response. What do you think I should do? Patricia considered the question carefully, bringing her operational experience to bear on what was essentially a personnel management crisis. You need to act quickly and decisively. If clients start canceling contracts and employees start leaving, it won't matter how good your strategic plans are. You'll be managing the decline of a company rather than leading its growth. I can address the client concerns directly by scheduling meetings and demonstrating our capabilities. But the employee retention issue is more complicated. Not necessarily. Most of our workers have been with the company for years. They're not looking to leave unless they genuinely believe their jobs are threatened. If you can communicate clearly about your plans and show that you're committed to growth rather than downsizing, they'll probably stay. And Daniel? Patricia's expression hardened with the resolve of someone who'd made a difficult decision. Daniel is acting like a disgruntled former employee rather than a current executive. If he's not willing to support the company's success under new leadership, then he shouldn't be in a leadership position. Are you suggesting I should fire him? I'm suggesting that you should hold him accountable for his actions and make it clear that undermining the company's stability is unacceptable behavior for any employee, regardless of their family relationship or previous position. The conversation with Patricia had clarified the immediate challenges I was facing, but it had also confirmed that I had at least one family member who was willing to prioritize the company's success over personal grievances. Her support would be crucial in the coming weeks as I worked to stabilize operations while implementing the strategic changes that would drive long-term growth. The meeting with David took place the following evening at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory that might minimize the emotional intensity of our conversation. David had always been the most sensitive member of the family, and I suspected that losing his shares in Richardson Industries felt like a personal betrayal rather than a business transaction. I don't understand why you did it this way, he said before I'd even had a chance to order my coffee. If you wanted to be more involved in the company, you could have just asked. We would have found a role for you. What kind of role? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. I don't know. Something that matched your interests and experience. Maybe managing the administrative side of operations, or overseeing employee benefits, or handling community relations. The response revealed everything about how David viewed my capabilities and potential contributions. Even after seeing the comprehensive strategic planning I'd done, and the financial resources I'd accumulated independently, he still couldn't imagine me in a leadership role that involved actual decision-making authority. David, I presented a detailed acquisition proposal at Christmas dinner. I tried to share market research and strategic recommendations during family meetings. Every suggestion I made was dismissed as naive or irrelevant. That was just family conversation, David protested. We didn't realize you were serious about wanting to participate in business decisions. How could I not be serious? Harold built Richardson Industries and I helped him do it. I kept the books, managed the finances, and supported his vision for 40 years. When he died, I was suddenly treated like a dependent rather than a partner. David was stirring his coffee with the nervous energy of someone who was uncomfortable with confrontation, but felt compelled to defend his position. We were trying to protect you from the stress of business management. Running a company is complicated and demanding. More complicated than raising 2 children alone after their father died? More demanding than building a successful tailoring business while managing household finances and supporting family members through various crises? The comparison seemed to catch David off guard, and I could see him reconsidering assumptions he'd never questioned before. I never thought about it that way. Because you never had to. For 8 years, I've been invisible to this family except when you needed financial support or practical help. Now that I've demonstrated that I have business capabilities you didn't recognize, you're upset about the methods I used rather than acknowledging the results I achieved. You manipulated us, David said, his voice carrying more hurt than anger. You tricked me into giving up my shares by pretending to be someone else. I offered you a business loan with favorable terms when no traditional lender would take the risk on your company. The fact that your business failed and you defaulted on the loan isn't manipulation. It's the natural consequence of poor planning and unrealistic expectations. David was quiet for several minutes, processing the reality that his entrepreneurial venture had failed regardless of who provided the financing. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued but more thoughtful than defensive. What happens now? To my job at Richardson Industries? I opened the folder containing his revised employment agreement and placed it on the table between us. That depends on whether you're willing to accept a position that matches your actual skills and experience. David reviewed the job description with growing confusion. Assistant Operations Coordinator? That's basically an entry-level management position. It's a position that will allow you to learn operational management while contributing to the company's growth. If you perform well and demonstrate competence, there will be opportunities for advancement. I've been working at Richardson Industries for 12 years. I know how the company operates. You've been working in a marketing coordination role that your Uncle Daniel created specifically for you, with responsibilities that were never clearly defined and performance standards that were never enforced. The position I'm offering has specific duties, measurable objectives, and accountability requirements. David looked genuinely shocked by my assessment of his previous role, as if the possibility that his job had been nepotistic rather than merit-based had never occurred to him. You think I've been coasting? I think you've been underutilized because no one ever challenged you to develop your potential. The question is whether you're willing to work harder in order to contribute more. And if I say no? Then you'll receive a severance package and we'll wish you well in your future endeavors. David spent the rest of our meeting asking detailed questions about the assistant coordinator position, the reporting structure, and the performance expectations. Unlike Patricia, who had immediately understood the strategic context of the EDOM restructuring, David seemed focused on how the changes would affect him personally, rather than how they might benefit the company. I need time to think about this, he said finally. You have until Friday afternoon to decide. After that, I'll assume you're choosing the severance option and we'll proceed accordingly. Mom, David said as we prepared to leave, using the family term that sounded strange in the context of our business discussion. I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished, even if I don't understand how you did it or why you felt you had to do it this way. Thank you, I replied. That means more to me than you might realize. The conversation with Marcus was scheduled for Thursday evening, but he canceled at the last minute, claiming a family emergency that I suspected was fabricated. Instead, he sent me a text message stating that he would be accepting the severance package and pursuing other opportunities. The message was brief and formal, lacking any acknowledgement of our family relationship or the years of support I'd provided during his various financial difficulties. Marcus's response wasn't surprising, but it was disappointing. Of all the family members involved in Richardson Industries, he had always been the least committed to the company's success and the most focused on extracting maximum benefit with minimum effort. His departure would actually simplify the transition process, even though losing his institutional knowledge would create some short-term challenges. The final conversation was with Daniel, and it took place in the Richardson Industries conference room where the ownership transition had been announced. Daniel had requested a formal meeting rather than a personal discussion, which suggested he was approaching the situation as a business negotiation rather than a family conversation. I've reviewed the employment agreement you prepared, he began, placing the document on the table with the gravity of someone delivering important news. The reporting structure you're proposing is unacceptable. Which aspects concern you? All of them. You're essentially asking me to accept a demotion from CEO to senior manager, with oversight from a board of directors that you control completely. That's not a restructuring, it's a humiliation. It's a realistic assessment of the leadership capabilities you've demonstrated over the past 8 years, I replied. Richardson Industries has been profitable under your management, but it hasn't grown, it hasn't innovated, and it hasn't expanded into new markets despite numerous opportunities. Daniel's face reddened with the anger of someone who was accustomed to authority and respect being accorded automatically rather than earned through performance. I've maintained the company Harold built. I've preserved jobs, satisfied clients, and generated consistent returns for shareholders. You've managed decline disguised as stability. Our market share has eroded, our competitive position has weakened, and our revenue growth has lagged behind industry averages for 5 consecutive years. And you think you can do better? I know I can do better because I've spent 2 years studying what needs to change and developing specific plans for implementing those changes. Daniel stood and walked to the window overlooking the manufacturing floor. The same view that Harold used to say reminded him of the pride and purpose that came from building something valuable. When Daniel turned back toward me, his expression had shifted from anger to something that might have been resignation. "This isn't about business performance," he said quietly. "This is about revenge. You're punishing us for not recognizing your contributions and treating you like an equal partner. If this were about revenge, I would have destroyed the company rather than investing millions of dollars in its improvement. I'm offering you the opportunity to continue working here in a role that matches your capabilities and supports the company's growth. As a subordinate to someone who's never managed anything more complicated than a household budget. As a team member, contributing to a vision that extends beyond maintaining comfortable mediocrity." Daniel returned to his seat and stared at the employment agreement with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had no acceptable solution. "What guarantees do I have that you won't fire me the moment I make a decision you disagree with?" "The same guarantees any employee has that they'll be treated fairly as long as their performance meets professional standards. And if I refuse the position, then you'll receive 6-month severance pay and will handle the transition as professionally as possible." Daniel was quiet for nearly 10 minutes, reading through the detailed job description and considering his options. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled with 8 years of family dynamics and business decisions that had led to this moment of reckoning. "I built my career on this company," he finally said. "Harold trusted me to carry on his legacy, and I've done that to the best of my ability." Harold also believed in growth and innovation. He took risks, pursued new opportunities, and constantly challenged himself and his company to achieve more. The Harold I knew would have been disappointed by the conservative approach you've taken. And you think you knew Harold better than I did? I think I knew Harold differently than you did. You knew him as a successful businessman who had already achieved his major goals. I knew him as someone who was constantly pushing boundaries and taking calculated risks to build something bigger than anyone thought possible. Daniel folded the employment agreement and placed it in his briefcase with deliberate precision. "I'll need the weekend to make my decision." "Of course, but I want to be clear about something. Regardless of your decision about the employment agreement, I expect you to stop undermining the company's relationships with clients and employees. Richardson Industries' success benefits everyone, including you, whether you choose to stay or leave." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Daniel, I know you've been calling our major clients to suggest they might want to diversify their supplier relationships. I know you've been telling employees that massive layoffs are planned. That behavior needs to stop immediately." Daniel's face showed no surprise at being confronted with this information, confirming that Patricia's assessment had been accurate. "I've been managing relationships that I've spent years building. If clients are concerned about continuity under new management, they deserve honest answers about potential risks. They deserve factual information about the company's capabilities and commitments, not speculation designed to create doubt about our stability. And what if I continue managing client relationships the way I think is appropriate?" The question was clearly a challenge, testing whether I was prepared to take decisive action when family members actively opposed my leadership. The answer, would establish precedents that would affect every future interaction with employees, clients, and business partners. Then you'll be terminated immediately for conduct detrimental to the company's interests, I replied without hesitation. Family relationship or not, I won't allow anyone to sabotage Richardson Industries' success. Daniel nodded slowly as if my response had confirmed something he'd been wondering about. You really have changed, haven't you? I've finally stopped pretending that being accommodating and invisible serves anyone's best interests. And you're prepared to fire your own family members to prove that point? I'm prepared to protect the company Harold built and the employees who depend on it for their livelihoods. If that requires difficult personnel decisions, then I'll make those decisions. Daniel gathered his briefcase and headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. For what it's worth, Eleanor, I think Harold would have been impressed by what you've accomplished. He always said that the most dangerous competitors were the ones nobody saw coming. After Daniel left, I remained in the conference room for another hour, reviewing the notes from my conversations with each family member and planning the immediate steps necessary to stabilize operations while implementing strategic changes. Patricia had agreed to stay and contribute to the company's growth. David was still considering his options but seemed inclined to accept the restructured position. Marcus had chosen to leave, which eliminated one source of internal resistance. Daniel's decision was still pending, but his acknowledgement that he needed to stop undermining client relationships suggested he might be willing to work within the new structure. The real work of transforming Richardson Industries was just beginning, but the foundation had been established. I had control of the company, a clear vision for its future, and at least some family members who were willing to prioritize business success over personal grievances. The next phase would determine whether my confidence in the company's potential was justified, and whether the strategic changes I'd planned would actually deliver the growth and innovation that had been missing under previous management. But, for the first time in 8 years, I was optimistic about Richardson Industries' future, not because the challenges ahead would be easy, but because I finally had the authority to address them directly, rather than watching from the sidelines while opportunities were wasted and potential remained unrealized. The transformation of Richardson Industries began to show tangible results within 6 weeks of my taking control. The renewable energy division launched with 3 major contracts secured, including the Green Tech Solutions partnership that Amanda had expedited during the initial client crisis. Our manufacturing floor was running at full capacity for the first time in 18 months, and the efficiency improvements Patricia had implemented were already reducing waste by 12%. Standing in the quality control department on site on a crisp October morning, watching technicians test solar panel mounting hardware that bore the Richardson Industries logo, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond simple business success. These products represented the vision I'd tried to share during that disastrous Christmas dinner, the same vision that Marcus had dismissed as experimental green stuff and Jessica had called a passing trend. The installation crews are reporting that our mounting systems are 30% faster to deploy than our competitors, Patricia said, joining me at the observation window with a tablet full of performance metrics. The engineering improvements you suggested have eliminated 2 assembly steps without compromising structural integrity. What's the customer feedback been like? Exceptional. GreenTech wants to expand their order by 40% for the next quarter, and we've received inquiries from 3 other solar installation companies who want to discuss exclusive partnerships. The irony wasn't lost on me that Patricia, who had initially questioned my ability to understand manufacturing complexities, was now enthusiastically reporting on innovations that had emerged directly from suggestions she'd once dismissed. But there was no smugness in my satisfaction, only gratitude that competent people were finally willing to implement improvements that would benefit everyone. Have you heard from Daniel this week? I asked, noting that his response to the restructured employment agreement was now overdue by several days. He came in Tuesday morning to clean out his office, Patricia replied carefully. He didn't say much, just packed his personal items and left his keycard on the reception desk. Did he speak with any of the other employees? Bethany said he shook hands with a few people in the engineering department, but he didn't make any announcements or give any speeches. It was very quiet and professional. Daniel's departure, while not entirely unexpected, created both relief and concern. Relief because it eliminated the primary source of internal sabotage, but concern because his institutional knowledge and client relationships were genuinely valuable assets that would be difficult to replace. However, the fact that he'd left quietly, rather than creating drama, suggested that he'd accepted the reality of the situation and wouldn't continue undermining efforts from the outside. What about staffing for his responsibilities? I've been working with Amanda Chen to identify candidates for a new general manager position, Patricia said. She's recommended 3 executives with manufacturing experience who specialize in growth companies rather than maintenance operations. Good. I want someone who shares our vision for expansion rather than someone who's comfortable with the status quo. The conversation was interrupted by David, who approached us with the focused energy of someone who had news to share. Since accepting the assistant operations coordinator position, David had been working with an intensity I'd never seen from him before. Whether it was the structure of clear expectations or the motivation of proving himself in a merit-based environment, his performance had been consistently impressive. The Hartwell manufacturing acquisition is moving faster than expected, he said, offering his tablet so we could review the updated timeline. Their board approved our offer yesterday, and the Sa due diligence process should be completed by next Friday. The Hartwell acquisition had been the centerpiece of my original Christmas dinner proposal. The opportunity that Daniel had rejected as too risky, and Marcus had mocked as beyond our capabilities. Now it was becoming reality, adding sustainable building materials and eco-friendly construction products to our portfolio while expanding our market reach into segments our competitors had ignored. What's the integration timeline looking like? I asked, scrolling through David's detailed project plan. 6 months for full operational integration, but we can begin marketing their products under the Richardson Industries brand within 60 days. The revenue projections show break-even by month 8 and substantial profitability by the end of year 2. Patricia was reviewing the financial projections with the analytical focus that made her such a valuable team member. These numbers assume we can retain their key employees and maintain their existing client relationships. I've scheduled meetings with their senior staff next week, David replied. The acquisition includes retention bonuses for critical personnel and transition agreements that protect their customer base during the integration period. Watching David present complex business analysis with confidence and competence, I realized that his previous underperformance hadn't reflected a lack of ability, but rather a lack of appropriate challenges and clear expectations. Given meaningful work and accountability standards, he was demonstrating capabilities that years of nepotistic employment had never revealed. Excellent work, I said, genuinely impressed by the thoroughness of his preparation. This is exactly the kind of strategic planning that will drive our long-term growth. David's smile reflected both pride in his accomplishment and surprise at receiving recognition based purely on merit rather than family relationship. It feels good to be working on projects that actually matter to the company's future. The comment revealed something important about how family employment had affected not just the company's performance, but also the family members' sense of purpose and achievement. When success was guaranteed regardless of effort, there was no incentive to excel and no satisfaction in accomplishment. Now that employment was contingent on performance, the same people were discovering capabilities they'd never been motivated to develop. I have some news to share as well, I said, opening my own folder to reveal documents that would reshape Richardson Industries' competitive position even more dramatically than the acquisitions and efficiency improvements we'd already implemented. We've been selected as the primary hardware supplier for the Riverside Green Development Project. Patricia's eyes widened as she processed the implications. Riverside Green was a $2 billion sustainable community development that would Include residential, commercial, and industrial buildings, all constructed to the highest environmental standards. Being selected as their primary supplier meant guaranteed revenue for the next 4 years and positioning Richardson Industries as a leader in the green construction market. How did we even get considered for a project that size? David asked. Amanda's firm has connections with the development consortium, and our renewable energy products gave us credibility in the sustainability sector. But the real deciding factor was our commitment to innovation and quality improvement rather than just maintaining existing capabilities. What's the revenue impact? Patricia asked, already calculating how this contract would affect our production, capacity and staffing requirements. Approximately $18 million over 4 years, with potential extensions if the development expands beyond the initial phase. It's the largest contract in Richardson Industries' history. The magnitude of the opportunity was exactly what I'd envisioned when I first started planning the company's transformation. Not just incremental growth, but the kind of breakthrough success that establishes market leadership and creates sustainable competitive advantages. The same company that had been coasting on legacy relationships under previous management was now positioned to become an industry innovator. We'll need to expand our manufacturing capacity significantly, Patricia observed, her operational expertise immediately focusing on implementation challenges. Already planned for, I replied, producing additional documents that outlined facility expansion and equipment acquisition timelines. We're leasing additional space in the industrial park next month, and the new production equipment will be installed by December. What about workforce expansion? 35 new positions over the next 6 months, including skilled technicians, quality control specialists, and supervisory personnel. I want to hire people who share our commitment to excellence rather than just filling positions with whoever applies. David was studying the project timeline with the detailed attention of someone who understood that his career advancement depended on successful execution. This is going to require coordination across every department: manufacturing, quality, control, logistics, customer service, even accounting and human resources. Which is why we're implementing new project management systems and communication protocols, I said. Everyone needs to understand how their role contributes to overall success, and everyone needs to be held accountable for meeting their commitments. The conversation continued for another hour as we discussed specific implementation challenges and resource allocation strategies. What struck me most powerfully was the energy and enthusiasm that had replaced the complacent routine that had characterized family meetings under previous management. People were excited about the company's future, rather than simply going through familiar motions. As Patricia and David returned to their respective departments, I remained in the quality control area, watching technicians perform tests that would ensure our products met the exacting standards required for the Riverside Green project. The precision and attention to detail I was observing reflected a cultural transformation that went beyond new contracts and improved processes. Workers who had been performing routine tasks with minimal oversight were now approaching their responsibilities with the focus of people who understood that their work contributed to something meaningful. Quality standards that had been acceptable for maintaining existing business were being elevated to meet the requirements of discerning clients who demanded excellence rather than adequacy. The phone call that interrupted my observations came from Bill Thompson, the construction company owner who had been skeptical about working with Richardson Industries under new management. His concerns had been the catalyst for accelerating our transition timeline, and his account remained one of our most important client relationships. Mrs. Richardson, Thompson's voice carried a warmth that had been absent during our previous conversation. I wanted to call personally to thank you for the exceptional service we've been receiving lately. I'm pleased to hear that, Bill. What specifically has impressed you? Everything. Faster delivery times, improved quality control, better communication from your customer service team. Whatever changes you've implemented are definitely working. We've been focusing on operational efficiency and customer satisfaction rather than just maintaining existing processes. Well, it shows. In fact, I'm calling because we're bidding on a major municipal project that will require specialized hardware components. If we get the contract, we'd like Richardson Industries to be our exclusive supplier for the metal fabrication elements. The conversation continued for 20 minutes as Thompson outlined the project requirements and timeline. The contract he was describing would represent another significant revenue opportunity, but more importantly, it demonstrated that our reputation for quality and reliability was expanding through word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied clients. After Thompson hung up, I called Amanda Chen to share the news and discuss how this potential contract would fit into our overall growth strategy. Amanda had become much more than a business consultant over the past year. She was the strategic partner who helped me translate vision into actionable plans. "The timing is perfect," Amanda said after reviewing the project specifications Thompson had sent. "This contract would fill the production capacity gap between completing current orders and beginning full-scale work on the Riverside Green project. What about our ability to handle multiple large contracts simultaneously?" That's where the organizational improvements you've implemented become crucial. Under the previous management structure, Richardson Industries couldn't have handled this volume of business because there weren't systems in place for coordinating complex projects across multiple departments. And now? Now you have competent people in clearly defined roles with performance accountability and communication protocols that enable effective collaboration. The infrastructure is finally matching the ambition. Amanda's assessment highlighted something important about the transformation process that went beyond financial metrics and production statistics. Successful growth required not just better products and more efficient processes, but also organizational maturity that could support increased complexity and higher performance standards. Have you given any thought to what comes next? Amanda asked, beyond the current contracts and acquisitions? What do you mean? Richardson Industries is positioned to become a major player in the sustainable construction market. The question is whether you want to remain a regional manufacturer serving specialized niches, or expand into a national company that competes with the industry leaders. The question forced me to articulate ambitions I'd been developing subconsciously, but hadn't yet expressed explicitly. When I first started planning the company's transformation, my goals had been focused on proving that better management could unlock the potential that family leadership had been wasting. But success had created new possibilities that extended far beyond my original vision. What would national expansion require? Additional capital investment, strategic partnerships, possibly geographic diversification of manufacturing facilities. The expertise you've developed in sustainable products gives you a competitive advantage, but scaling nationally means competing with companies that have much larger resources and established market presence. Is that something you think we could accomplish? Absolutely. But it would require the same kind of strategic planning and systematic implementation that you've used for the current transformation. And it would mean accepting even more risk and responsibility than you've already taken on. The prospect was both exhilarating and intimidating. 18 months earlier, I'd been the invisible widow whose business opinions were dismissed as irrelevant. Now I was being presented with the possibility of building Richardson Industries into a company that could compete with industry giants. "Let me think about it," I said finally. "Right now I want to focus on executing the current growth plan successfully before considering additional expansion." "Smart approach," Amanda agreed. "Build the foundation properly before adding more floors to the building." The afternoon brought a different kind of satisfaction when I received a call from Marcus requesting a meeting to discuss possible consulting opportunities with Richardson Industries. The nephew, who had accepted a severance package rather than adapting to new performance standards, was now hoping to work with the company as an outside contractor. "I've been following the news about Richardson Industries' recent contracts," Marcus said when we met for coffee downtown. "It sounds like business is really taking off." "We've been fortunate to secure some significant opportunities," I replied neutrally, curious about where the conversation was heading. I was wondering if there might be consulting projects where my experience with the company could be valuable. I know the client relationships, the operational procedures, the vendor networks. What kind of consulting are you envisioning? Business development, maybe. Client relationship management. Project coordination for some of the larger contracts. Marcus's proposal revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of why Richardson Industries was succeeding under new management. He was offering to provide exactly the kind of maintenance-oriented, relationship-dependent services that had characterized the company's previous approach to business. What he didn't understand was that our success was based on moving beyond those limitations rather than refinishing them. "Marcus, I appreciate your interest in contributing to the company's success," I said carefully, "but we're focused on building internal capabilities rather than relying on external consultants for core business functions, even for someone with my institutional knowledge, especially for someone with institutional knowledge of systems and approaches we're working to improve." The rejection clearly disappointed Marcus, but it also seemed to surprise him. Perhaps he'd expected that family relationship would override business considerations, or that I would welcome his expertise regardless of how he'd responded to the restructuring process. "I guess I misread the situation," he said finally. "You misread my priorities," I corrected gently. "Richardson Industries' success depends on having team members who are committed to excellence and growth, not people who are looking for ways to benefit from that success without contributing to it." "Is that how you see me? As someone who doesn't contribute?" "I see you as someone who chose comfort over challenge when given the opportunity to be part of the company's transformation. That was your decision to make, but it has consequences." Marcus left the coffee shop with the deflated expression of someone who had assumed that bridges could be easily rebuilt after being burned. His request for consulting work reflected the same entitled attitude that had characterized his approach to family employment, the assumption that previous relationship entitled him to ongoing benefits regardless of current performance or commitment. The encounter reinforced my conviction that successful transformation required clear boundaries and consistent application of performance standards. Family relationships couldn't be allowed to override business judgment and past contributions, couldn't substitute for present commitment to excellence. The week concluded with the first quarterly board meeting under the new ownership structure, held in the same conference room where I'd announced my acquisition of controlling interest 3 months earlier. But the atmosphere was completely different. Now, focused on reviewing achievements and planning continued growth rather than managing resistance to change. Patricia presented operational metrics that demonstrated significant improvements in efficiency, quality, and customer satisfaction. David reported on the progress of the Hartwell acquisition and the implementation timeline for the Riverside Green contract. The new general manager, a seasoned executive named Robert Chen, whom Amanda had recruited from a larger manufacturing company, outlined staffing plans and facility expansion schedules. Revenue for the quarter exceeded projections by 18%, I announced, reviewing financial statements that reflected the tangible results of strategic planning and operational improvements. More importantly, our profit margins have improved by 12% due to efficiency gains and higher value contracts. "What's the outlook for next quarter?" Robert asked. "If we execute successfully on current commitments and secure the additional contracts we're pursuing, we're looking at revenue growth of approximately 40% compared to the same period last year." The numbers represented more than just business success. They validated every decision I'd made during the transformation process. The company that family members had been content to manage as a comfortable legacy was now growing at a pace that positioned it for industry leadership. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge the contributions everyone has made to these results," I continued. looking around the table at people who had chosen to embrace change rather than resist it. Patricia's operational improvements have been essential to our ability to handle increased volume while maintaining quality standards. David's project management has ensured that we're meeting client commitments and integration deadlines. Robert's leadership in manufacturing has created the workforce capabilities we need for continued expansion. What about you? Patricia asked. What's your assessment of your own performance as the new owner and CEO? The question caught me slightly off guard, but it also provided an opportunity to articulate something important about leadership and accountability. I think I've proven that strategic vision and systematic planning can unlock potential that was being wasted under previous management. But the real test isn't what we've accomplished so far. It's whether we can continue growing and improving over the long term. Any regrets about how you handled the transition? None about the business decisions, I replied honestly. Some regrets about the personal relationships that were damaged in the process, but not about the necessity of making difficult changes. Do you think the family relationships can be repaired? I think they can evolve into something different, and potentially better, based on mutual respect rather than traditional assumptions about roles and capabilities. But that will require effort from everyone involved. The meeting concluded with planning discussions for the next quarter's objectives and resource allocation priorities. As people gathered their materials and prepared to leave, I reflected on how dramatically the dynamics had changed from the meetings I'd attended as Harold's silent widow. Instead of being the invisible observer whose presence was tolerated, but whose opinions were irrelevant, I was now the decision-maker, whose vision shaped the company's direction and whose approval was required for major initiatives. The transformation from background figure to central authority had required not just financial maneuvering and strategic planning, but also personal growth that I was still processing. Walking through the manufacturing facility after the meeting, observing workers who were producing innovative products for demanding clients under efficient management systems, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond simple business achievement. This was what Harold had envisioned when he started Richardson Industries, a company that combined quality craftsmanship with strategic innovation to create value for clients, employees, and the community. The family members who had dismissed my capabilities and underestimated my determination had inadvertently provided the motivation I needed to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed. Their assumption that I was financially dependent and business naive had given me the invisibility necessary to plan and execute a transformation they never saw coming. But now, the real work was just beginning. Proving that I could acquire control of the company had been challenging, but proving that I could lead it to sustained success would require different skills and longer-term commitment. The strategic vision was clear, the operational foundation was solid, and the team was committed to excellence. Whether that would be sufficient for the national expansion Amanda had suggested remained to be seen. Standing in Harold's old office, now my office, looking out at a company that was thriving under leadership that no one had expected, I felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The woman who had been dismissed as irrelevant had become indispensable, and the company that had been coasting on past achievements was now positioned for a future that exceeded everyone's expectations. 2 years later, I stood on the stage of the National Manufacturing Excellence Awards ceremony, holding a crystal trophy that recognized Richardson Industries as Sustainable Innovation Company of the Year. The auditorium was filled with industry, leaders, competitors, and journalists who had come to celebrate achievements in manufacturing excellence and environmental responsibility. The same woman who had once been told to stick to balancing checkbooks was now being recognized as a visionary leader who had transformed a regional family business into a national powerhouse in sustainable construction materials. Richardson Industries employed over 400 people across 3 states, maintained partnerships with major construction companies nationwide, and had become the preferred supplier for green building projects from California to New York. In the audience, I could see Patricia beaming with pride as she recorded the ceremony on her phone. She had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer 6 months earlier, overseeing operations that had grown beyond anything we'd imagined when she first accepted the restructured position I'd offered. Her expertise in operational efficiency had become legendary in our industry, and she'd been invited to speak at conferences about sustainable manufacturing processes. David sat beside her, wearing the confident expression of someone who had discovered capabilities he never knew he possessed. As Vice President of Strategic Development, he now managed acquisition analysis and market expansion initiatives that had added 12 companies to our portfolio. The nephew, who had once struggled with basic marketing coordination, was now closing deals worth tens of millions of dollars. Even Marcus was there, though not as a family member celebrating our success. He was representing a competitor who had hired him as a regional sales manager after his consulting proposal had been rejected. I felt no animosity toward his presence, only a quiet satisfaction that everyone had found their appropriate place in the industry ecosystem. When I acquired controlling interest in Richardson Industries, I said into the microphone, my voice carrying clearly across the silent auditorium, many people questioned whether someone without traditional business experience could lead a manufacturing company. Tonight's recognition validates the belief that vision, determination, and strategic thinking matter more than conventional credentials. The applause was warm and sustained, but what meant more to me than industry recognition was the knowledge that hundreds of families now depended on Richardson Industries for their livelihoods, and that those families were working for a company that valued innovation, integrity, and environmental responsibility above short-term profits. Excellence isn't achieved by maintaining what previous generations built, I continued. It's achieved by honoring their vision while having the courage to exceed their expectations. Harold Richardson started this company with the belief that quality craftsmanship and strategic innovation could create lasting value. Today's recognition proves that his vision was even bigger than he imagined. After the ceremony, Amanda Chen found me at the reception, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the satisfied smile of someone whose strategic planning had achieved everything she'd predicted and more. So, she said, offering me a glass, are you ready to discuss that national expansion we talked about 2 years ago? Amanda, we've already achieved national expansion. We have facilities in Ohio, Texas, and North Carolina. We're supplying projects in 38 states. I'm talking about international expansion now. The European sustainable construction market is exploding, and Richardson Industries has exactly the expertise and reputation to compete successfully overseas. The suggestion should have seemed overwhelming, but instead it felt like the natural next step in a journey that had already exceeded every expectation I'd dared to hold. The woman who had been invisible at family dinners was now being invited to consider global opportunities that would have been inconceivable just a few years earlier. What would that require? Strategic partnerships with European manufacturers, regulatory compliance for international markets, probably establishment of overseas production facilities within 5 years. It's ambitious, but no more ambitious than what you've already accomplished. As Amanda outlined the possibilities for international growth, I found myself thinking about Harold and wondering what he would have thought of the company Richardson Industries had become. The garage-based operation he'd started with 2 part-time employees was now an industry leader that was being courted for expansion into global markets. But more than business success, I thought about the personal transformation that had made everything else possible. The quiet widow who had accepted dismissal and invisibility had discovered strengths she'd never known she possessed. The family member who had been told her ideas were irrelevant had proven that strategic vision and determined execution could overcome any obstacle. I'll consider it, I told Amanda, though we both knew that consideration was really just preparation for another ambitious leap forward. The evening concluded with informal conversations among industry leaders who wanted to understand how Richardson Industries had achieved such remarkable growth in such a short time. Some asked about acquisition strategies, others about operational innovations. But the most frequent question was about leadership philosophy and decision-making processes. The secret, I told a group of executives from competing companies, isn't having all the answers from the beginning. It's being willing to learn, adapt, and make difficult decisions when circumstances require them. And it's surrounding yourself with competent people who share your commitment to excellence rather than people who are simply comfortable with mediocrity. Driving home that night, I passed the house on Maple Street where I'd lived as Harold's widow, the same house where I'd felt invisible and irrelevant for so many years. I'd kept the house, though I rarely spent time there anymore, preferring the downtown condominium that better reflected the life I'd built for myself. The next morning brought calls from business journalists wanting to interview the unlikely CEO who had transformed a family company into an industry leader. One reporter asked whether I had advice for other women who felt underestimated or overlooked in family businesses. "Don't wait for other people to recognize your capabilities," I said. "If you know you can contribute something valuable, find a way to prove it rather than hoping someone will eventually invite you to participate. And don't be afraid to bet on yourself, even when the stakes seem impossibly high." Any regrets about the methods you used to gain control of the company? None. The results speak for themselves. Richardson Industries is more successful, more innovative, and more valuable than it ever was under previous management. Sometimes transformation requires dramatic action rather than gradual change. The interview concluded with questions about future plans and long-term vision for the company. I found myself describing possibilities that would have seemed like fantasy when I was sitting silently in family meetings, listening to decisions being made about a company I'd helped build but wasn't allowed to influence. That afternoon, Patricia called to share news that perfectly captured the magnitude of what we'd accomplished together. "The Harvard Business School wants to write a case study about Richardson Industries' transformation," she said. "They're particularly interested in the strategic planning process and the organizational changes that enabled such rapid growth." "What did you tell them?" "That they'd need to interview you directly, because the real story isn't about business techniques or management theories. It's about what happens when someone refuses to accept limitations that other people try to impose on them." The conversation reminded me of something Amanda had said during our early planning sessions, that the most successful transformations come from people who understand both what needs to change and what needs to be preserved. Richardson Industries had honored Harold's commitment to quality and integrity while abandoning the conservative approach that had limited its potential for growth. Looking back on the journey from invisible widow to industry leader, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about business strategy or financial planning. It was about the power of refusing to remain invisible when you have something valuable to contribute. The family members who had dismissed my ideas had inadvertently taught me that respect can't be earned through accommodation and silence, but only through demonstrated competence and unwavering commitment to excellence. Richardson Industries now employed people who had never heard of the quiet woman who used to sit in the corner during board meetings, who had no idea that their innovative workplace had once been managed by people who mistook comfort for success. Those employees knew only that they worked for a company that valued their contributions, rewarded their performance, and challenged them to achieve more than they'd thought possible. And that, more than any award or recognition, was the legacy I was most proud to have created. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.